Welcome. We're going to be talking today about separation of religion and government, which is not quite the same thing as separation of. It's not quite the same thing as separation of church and state.
Okay.
But we'll be seeing what the differences are, and it does exist in many places actually, but it exists in different ways in different parts of the world. We're not doing a full global survey. We're really going to focus more on the United States. And I will say I am not a constitutional expert. I'm not a lawyer who studied this in great depth. I'm more interested in the history of this phenomenon and also some of the philosophical angles of how best to adjudicate these kind of issues. I wanted to start by giving you some examples of cases that at least some people find difficult to resolve when it comes to the balance of religion and government interest. One case that was famous was a case of a Native American tribe who had a religious requirement to take what was an illegal drug. Peyote, right? It was part of their religious rituals to have these hallucinogenic experiences and to take a particularly prescribed drug, which under federal law was illegal. And so, in theory, they shouldn't have been able to do this, or certainly off of their own lands. Tribal law sometimes would supersede, but if they're in a city somewhere else, could they in fact have their religious freedom to exercise this practice?
Yeah, Aaron, what's up?
The federal law that prohibits it. Another example, I mean, you could go more recently, or actually further back, alcohol during Prohibition. Both Catholic priests and rabbis had an exemption to use small quantities of sacramental wine because grape juice didn't cut it. They had to use wine for those purposes, and so they were allowed to have alcoholic beverages as a religious carve-out to Prohibition. Another example is if you have parents who are Christian Scientists, who don't believe in medical intervention. They see it as undermining their religious faith. Yet if they have a child with a medical emergency or in need of a blood transfusion or any number of other procedures, the state in the past has stepped in to supersede parental rights and to violate the parent's religion to save the life of the child. And then you have to decide, where does that line get drawn? I mean, you know, a child in a car accident is one thing. What about vaccinations? What about routine screenings? What about HPV vaccines and so on? So there's all kinds of areas of parental rights versus children's welfare where religion and state sometimes come into conflict. What if you have a high school valedictorian who's graduating, and as part of her speech or his speech, she decides to recite a prayer? It could be a Jewish prayer in Hebrew, a Shehechianu blessing, it could be a religious prayer to Jesus, it could be bowing down in a Muslim prayer. I mean, there's any number of prayers that could be offered, but it's a public school. Now, if a teacher were to do this in a classroom, that might be a red flag, that's too far. But what about a student who is given the opportunity to speak to his or her classmates and who feels fundamentally this moment is not meaningful if not offered in the spirit of their personal devotion? Are you going to tell them, A, they can't pray, or B, if they want to pray, here's what they're allowed to say and here's what they're not allowed to say? So you're actually telling them how to pray to their God. Well, it gets complicated. Here's one other example, and this is a case where my wife and I actually disagree with the general secular consensus. Let's say you live in an old New England town, established in 1650, and it has a beautiful old church that was built in 1710. And the roof is falling off, and the steeple needs shoring up. And it's a small town. There's 50 members of the congregation. They simply can't afford what it would take to maintain this historic building. It's still a functioning church, but they decide to apply for some historical preservation grant money to preserve this historical building, which is fundamental to the character of this old town. But it's a religious building. So can you use secular government money to support this religious building being used as a religious building? It's not like it's an old church that's become a museum or an old church that's become a community center. It's still a church. And part of you, if you want to preserve the character of the community, wants it to stay a church because that's what it's always been. It's been its function in the community. So do you draw a bright red line and say no government money for any religious building ever, no matter what? Or do you find circumstances that might be different? Actually, Hadash just applied and received a fair amount of money from the state of Illinois, federal government via state of Illinois, to provide security for our building. to add some exterior lighting and some other kind of security measures, we're getting government money to support a religious institution, actually two religious institutions, because we share space with the Unitarian Church. And so there's part of us that said, I don't know. But there's also part of us that said, this is to save lives. This is to help make our building and our people more secure, so it's worth it. Or, one other discussion that we'll come back to near the end is the question of religious-based discrimination. Can a religious-based charity choose whom to serve? Can a religious adoption agency choose what kind of couples not to serve? But it goes even to the level of, can a Jewish congregation insist that its rabbi be Jewish? That's discrimination, right? We are discriminating based on religious background when we're hiring clergy by insisting that our clergy has to be only one particular religious and ethnic group. Now, there is a clergy carve-out to discrimination laws because, you couldn't require Catholic churches to hire women priests, okay? Because it's part of the dogma of that particular tradition. But the question is, where does that line end? Can you insist that teachers in a parochial school can't be in a same-sex relationship because it's beyond the pale for that particular religious denomination, and they're role models to some extent? Or if they're not front-facing, could you require that of the janitorial service or the IT person who doesn't relate to the kids to rent? Where are you allowed to discriminate religiously? Like clergy, we might say, duh, of course you can choose your clergy based on your identity, but teachers, but custodial staff, support staff, then you have to decide where those lines are drawn.
There was a very recent case, in fact, of a coach at a Catholic school, I think, who was
in
like
Indiana.
a lacrosse coach or something, and they fired her because she was gay.
Right. And she sued, and they sued, and so it's an ongoing debate.
Was it a parochial school?
Yes, it was a Catholic school.
It was a Catholic school.
Right. Now, we do have to say that the separation of religion and government is not a historically Jewish idea. If you go back to the earliest sources in the Hebrew Bible, for example, there clearly is no separation between religion and government. In fact, if there's a king, it's God. And even if you choose a secular king or a this worldly king, that king has to accommodate to the realities of the law. And this is made very explicit in the book of Deuteronomy. And so in Deuteronomy, you can see this passage in chapter 17. If after you've settled the land that God has given to you and taken possession of it, you say, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You're not going to rely on a prophet like Moses or priest like Aaron. You'll choose a king. Be sure to choose one of your own people. Do not set a foreigner over you. And when the king is seated on his royal throne, he will have a copy of this Torah, this teaching, written for him on a scroll by the priests. It will remain with him, and he will read it all of his life, so he will learn to revere his God, to observe faithfully every word of this Torah, as well as these laws. And he will not deviate from the mitzvah, the commandment, to the right or to the left. So who's supreme here, the king or the law? It's the law. Yeah. The king has to study the law and follow the law and obey the law because the law comes from God. And the Levitical priests, the clergy, are the ones writing this law. So it is clearly not a separation of this worldly power of the king and the next worldly power of the priesthood. This is even more prominently the case after the exile in Babylon in 586 BCE. They returned about 515 BCE, and now it's just priests who are in charge. You don't even have any kind of monarchy left. So it clearly is a theocracy. Remember, the word theocracy literally means ruled by God, but since God does not attend meetings regularly, he generally has deputies, and the deputies are the clergy. So theocracy is a clergy rule, and that's what Jewish life has been actually predominantly for most of the centuries since, because you had the priests ruling, and then you had the Maccabean period where they were priest kings, they were sort of both, and then you had the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the conquest of the Romans, and then you have rabbis that take over, and the rabbis are directing Jewish life for several centuries until the Enlightenment. So we really have had a long history of Jewish theocracy and not a separation of religion and government. We see some of the challenges that's produced in modern Israel. We're not going to talk specifically about Israel today. We're doing that in a future class. But you can see that, again, the rabbis, the ultra-Orthodox, and even the sort of religious nationalist Jews there do not see a line between secular government and religious authority. So separation of religion and government, as much as Jews are attached to it now, is not a historically Jewish value. Now, it's also not historically a colonial American value either. Remember in the 1630s, Roger Williams is convicted of heresy and sedition in Massachusetts and is forced to flee. He finds up founding Providence, which becomes the capital of Rhode Island, and Rhode Island becomes a haven for those who want to have freedom of conscience. But the Puritans are not interested in freedom of conscience. When they want freedom for themselves to get under the thumb of the Church of England, but they are not interested in extending that freedom to all different varieties of Protestant Christianity, let alone those Catholics. They didn't want anything to do with Catholics. It really is the Enlightenment that sees the dawn of this idea that you should separate secular power, that is power in this world, from supernatural or religious authority. And we're going to look at a couple sources that talk about this. First, we'll look at Baruch Spinoza, who writes in his Theological Political Tractatus a very profound insight about the human condition. It is impossible for thought to be completely subject to another's control, because no one can give up to another his natural right to reason freely and form his own judgment about everything, nor can he be compelled to do so. No one can make you think anything. They can make you say things, right, but they can't make you think something. This is why a government is regarded as oppressive if it tries to control men's minds, and why a sovereign is thought to wrong its subjects and usurp their right if it seeks to tell them what they should embrace as true and reject as false, and prescribe the beliefs which should inspire their minds with devotion to God. In such matters, an individual cannot alienate his right even if he wishes. So if everyone is the master of their own thoughts by natural right, the attempt to make men speak only as the sovereign prescribes must always be met with very little success in a state. Frankly, because people can't hold their tongues. People are going to say what they think anyways, and it leads to disorder and disobedience to the sovereign and tension and violence. And I mean, he's coming out of looking at the English Civil War. He's living in Amsterdam, which has had a Protestant revolution against the Catholic Church under the authority of the Spanish monarchy. And so he's seeing the terrible violence that religious conflict produces. And his goal is that religion can teach people how to be good, teaches you how to be moral, but the sovereign makes the laws. And the sovereign should stay out of the religion business. Because once they start telling you what to think, they're violating your natural right to think for yourself, which is how the human brain works. Now, in the same time period as Spinoza is writing, John Locke in England is also writing about new ideas. And he provides an interesting counter perspective to Thomas Hobbes. If you read Thomas Hobbes, who writes about the English Civil War, he sees life as a disaster, everybody hates each other. He was also very secular.
Nasty, brutish, and short.
Nasty, brutish, and short is the famous line.
Yeah.
But Locke decides that rather than assume that you need tight control because people are such a mess, Locke says, let's open the doors. Let's tolerate diversity as a means of avoiding the conflict. If we have this value of tolerance, then we can actually live together. So he says in one part of his letter, I distinguish exactly the business of civil government from that of religion, and to set the just bounds that lie between one and the other. Here you see a separation of these two fields. If this be not done, there's be no end put to controversies that arise between those that have, or pretend to have, a concernment on the interests of men's souls, and on the other side, a care of the commonwealth. These are the two divisions. How do you go to heaven? And what do we do here and now? The care of their souls versus the care of the commonwealth. And the commonwealth, he says, is a society of men concerned with procuring, advancing their civil interests, like life, liberty, health, indolency of body, the possession of outward things, and so on. And the jurisdiction of magistrates only extends to those civil concernments. And it does not, and cannot, and ought not in any matter extend to the salvation of souls. So here you have very clearly an articulation of separating what do you do with business and society and laws and so on from morality and ultimately salvation as that style of religion. And in terms of what kind of religions are allowed, he actually keeps the door pretty open. Those whose doctrine is peaceable and whose manners are pure and blameless ought to be on equal terms with their fellow subjects. So if solemn assemblies, observation of festivals, public worship is permitted to any one of these, All of these should be permitted to Presbyterians, Independents, Anabaptists, Armenians, Quakers, and the others with the same liberty. If you're going to give it to one, give it to all. As long as they're peaceful, not disruptive, they should be able to have their freedom of conscience, so to speak. Nay, if we may openly speak the truth, neither pagan nor Mohammedan nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion.
Heresy.
Heresy to say this? Yeah.
Heresy.
I mean, for Protestant theology, I mean, letting the Catholics in was bad enough.
Yeah.
But letting in a Mohammedan or a pagan or a Jew? But here he says if they're peaceable and they get along and have good manners, and are sociable in that sense of getting along with society and obey the laws, and then sure, let them believe what they want, meet as they choose, private. So you see, this is sort of a foundation for the constitutional guarantee for free exercise, again, as long as civil order is maintained. However, Locke does draw a line. Slide to advance. Lastly, he says, those not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. So no atheists.
Yeah. Pagans are okay because they believe in spirits and things.
Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. This is a couple centuries before Dostoevsky, with no God all is permitted, right? But in this case, he again believes that you need religion to be a trustworthy person, to have your word be valuable, to have a fear of God, making you be good. If you don't have that, then we can't trust you. So atheists have to go. The taking away of God, but even in thought, dissolves all. Besides also, those that by their atheism undermine and destroy our religion can have no pretense of religion to challenge the privilege of a toleration. So the point is that they're going to undermine other people's belief too. So he's tolerant, but only within the framework of religious belief. It's ecumenical by our vocabulary.
I'm confused, you commented on it, but the paganism, why is that acceptable?
They still have some kind of a God concept or a supernatural concept.
Yeah, pagans, so pagan is a big category, obviously. Yeah. But typically, animists, as we often call them, I mean, take the Scandinavians before Christianity, they have gods, multiple gods. Yeah. Maybe there's a supreme god, and then they may believe that spirits and ancestors control, but they have a belief in the supernatural.
So it's the lack of belief.
It's a lack of
void of belief.
Right. So the
early Romans considered the early Christians considered the Romans and Greeks pagans.
Right.
They had formal worship of gods and temples and stuff, but it wasn't the right one for them. So. But they were considered pagans too.
So what Locke is describing here is really a radical tolerance with a much wider range than you would expect from someone of this period, although he still draws his line where some kind of God is required. So
I suspect he really doesn't understand what paganism is because it's not like a Kikuyu man would swear on some big god, and say.
I know, but all these people read Greek and Latin and stuff, and they knew about the pagans that.
Right, they weren't really thinking about Africans or Asians.
Right, they were thinking about Greeks and Romans.
Yeah, their context is European.
Right, the context.
Now, he also points out that even if you have some sects that have some wrong ideas, again, as long as they don't disorder society, let them be wrong. Put it out in the marketplace of ideas, we'll debate it, and then we'll see who's right. And if you have confidence that your belief is right, then you shouldn't be afraid of other people articulating their belief. Well, you'll win.
Is it that the atheists were considered threatening in a way that a pagan might not be because they had their own body?
They were threatening, and they were also untrustworthy. You couldn't believe their oaths and promises because they don't have the fear of God behind them. And also, keep in mind, it's not like there are hordes of pagans running around at this time. This is a hypothetical, right? There's also a lot of Mohammedans running around in England at the time. So
I wonder what he would have thought of something like voodoo. That's not the right name of it, but
I understand.
Something like that. Yeah, I can't remember the right name.
Yeah, we don't know.
But also, I think what Adam was saying is that atheism tends to undermine religion, which is an interesting thought when you think about it, because it's such a dangerous concept because people were willing to believe it. If it was a really wrong concept, people wouldn't bother to believe it, except a few. It's sort of interesting.
I believe that religion undermines atheism.
Well, it depends on what your value is, right?
Yeah, right.
So our basis for understanding separation of religion and government in this country goes back to the Constitution. But of course, there's a prehistory to that too.
Right.
Many of the writers of the Constitution read John Locke, read Spinoza, and had these ideas percolating as they were debating these questions. Shortly before the Constitution was written, there was actually a Virginia statute for religious freedom that was passed, authored by Jefferson and shepherded through the Virginia Assembly by James Madison. It actually was a reaction against a proposal. Someone had proposed levying a tax to support churches, but to do it ecumenically, you know, let every church apply and get some funding. But there was a big reaction against this, and so ultimately that led to this law being passed in 1786, shortly before the Constitution. And so this is just an excerpt from it. And it says at the very beginning, Almighty God hath created the mind free, and manifested his supreme will that free it shall remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint. Sounds very Spinoza, right? Can't make someone think something. All attempt to influence it by temporal punishments or civil incapacitations beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness. Again, I can make you lie, but I can't make you believe it. The impious presumption of legislators and rulers, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others and established false religions over the greatest part of the world through all time. So very willing to critique religious establishments here. But notice they're still citing Almighty God and a creator. So there's still an affirmation of piety, even as they're challenging the privileges of organized religion. So as part of their proclamation, they enacted that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever. So you don't have to attend, and you don't have to pay for it. No frequency or no support. Nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods. Nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. But all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and it will in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. They can vote, they can own property, they can own slaves, remember this is Virginia, and they can fully participate in society, again being white men, etc. But their belief system, they are allowed to have freedom of thought and freedom from imposed support for a religious institution.
And there's a real historical reason for that, because it comes right out of 1688 in England, and the Anglican Church enforced its rule upon people. So part of what they were rejecting, and people like Jefferson, who was a deist, was rejecting, was the idea that there should be that's why the Constitution says there shan't be establishment.
Yeah, we'll get to the Constitution language.
But this is what all this is coming from, and so they reacted very strongly against the imposition. But you had states like Maryland, which was Catholic based, which imposed rules and so forth, and
we'll talk about some of the holes. So in the Constitution, in the original text that was passed in 1789, you can see an echo of that Virginia statute. No religious test will ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Now, one of the questions of that is, does that mean federal office or does that mean state office? It actually wasn't until the 1960s that people began to challenge state laws based on this kind of a provision, because historically it was understood to only apply to federal laws. So I know someone, he actually wrote a book about his experience. His name is Herb Silverman, who is a very active Jewish atheist in South Carolina. He's a math professor at the College of Charleston. And he decided to challenge a law in South Carolina that said you had to profess a belief in God to hold a public office there, which he said is against this text of the Constitution. But again, does it apply to the states or not? So he actually applied to become a public notary, which is officially a public office. But he said he would not check the box saying, I believe in God, on the forms. And so then he had to sue them to get the right to become a public notary. And it went through several layers of courts before finally they had to concede that, yes, the Constitution supersedes and there should be no public, no religious test for public office, including even a notary public under the state law.
That box, check to believe in God, that's for any public office, or was in South Carolina.
I think so, yes.
Others, many states have.
Some states, yes. Some other states did have those kind of things on the books. Whether they were enforced or not, we don't know.
Right.
But as we'll see, the idea that the federal constitution applied to the states or superseded the states in all ways is not universal and not historical. If you go back to the founding period, we'll see examples of states that clearly established religion as a privileged class, and today we'd be appalled at that. But it wasn't until the 1940s to 60s that they began to apply these kind of ideas to state law, not just to federal law. Okay, so in the First Amendment to the Constitution, it says very clearly, Congress, well, I should say, it says clearly, but what it means is up for debate. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech or press or peaceable assembly and petition the government. So the first part is the key question for separation of religion and government. Congress will not establish a religion. That's what it means by making a law respecting an establishment. Not that they can't like do zoning laws on churches or something. It's that they can't establish an official church. Now this is again the federal Congress that can't do that. However, within a few years after that, they hired a chaplain. And actually, James Madison was initially supportive and then realized this is a bad idea. We shouldn't be hiring chaplains because guess what we're doing? We're picking one style of religion and making it the official chaplaincy of the Congress. But there are still chaplains even today in Congress. But there's a two-sided coin here. You've got not establishing a religion as a governmental diktat, but also not allowed to prohibit the free exercise of religion. That means freedom of practice, right? Freedom of belief. But, as we saw in some of those edge cases, what do you do with peyote? What do you do with child abuse? What do you do with... These are questions of free exercise versus promoting the general welfare, which is also part of the Constitution. Now, you may notice there is no separate, it does not say there's a separation of church and state. That doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. So if you get a right-wing zealot who says there's no separation of church and state in the Constitution, on a technical level, they're correct. It doesn't say that phrase. That phrase actually derives from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote while he was president to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. And Baptists were actually some of the first sort of religious dissenters from the mainstream. In fact, the first Baptist church in America was founded by Roger Williams in Providence. And that marked the beginning of his church, was baptism and ceremony. So in this letter, the Baptist to Jefferson had asked about his stance on religion and government, and he starts with some pious affirmations about the Creator, giving liberty, and so on. And then he says, religion is a matter which solely lies between man and his God, and he owes account to none other for his faith and worship. I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people which declared the legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between the church and state. So Jefferson's interpretation of that very clause is separation of church and state. That's his interpretation. Now, I'll point out that's church and state. So choosing a particular church versus a state, it's not all kinds of religion and government. If you wanted an absolute wall between religion and government, you wouldn't let anyone religious be in the government, right? They would have to check their religious beliefs at the door and not have it influence their decision in any way, which is impossible, and not allow them to profess any kind of public faith when they're on the public dollar. And so every president saying, God bless the United States, he has violated a strict, hermetic seal wall of religion and government. So it is separation of church and state. It's not quite religion and government in the absolute sense. There were examples of that. Think about the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, that was absolute separation of religion and government because you couldn't be religious and be in the government. It was officially an atheist country. But that's not necessarily a good model for us in terms of freedom of conscience or assembly or speech or anything else. Now, I'll also point out that state-established churches were not anathema. A few years ago, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas said he didn't see any problem with states establishing religion because they did it at the time of the founding. And so the founders who wrote the Constitution wanted no federal established church, but themselves helped to establish churches in the states. Then what's the problem if a state says, you can pray in a public school, or a state mandates Bible readings. What's the big deal? That's the state doing it, it's not the federal government. And so and people said he was crazy, but he's drawing on history. So here's one example. This is the original Constitution of the state of Massachusetts, drafted mostly by John Adams, and this was adopted in 1780. It is the right as well as the duty of all men in society, publicly and at stated seasons, to worship the Supreme Being, the Creator, the great Creator and Preserver of the universe. Notice if he just said Creator, that might have been a deist, like beginning of the, but this is the Preserver. He's actively involved in the world. And no subject shall be hurt, molested, restrained in his person for worshiping God in the manner seems agreeable to his own conscience or for his religious profession of sentiments, provided he doesn't disturb the public peace. You see again the John Locke idea that all religions are welcome as long as public peace is maintained or bothering others in their religious worship. But notice, it's the right and the duty. You have a positive duty to worship. And as the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government depends on piety, religion, morality. Again, you got Locke's rejection of the atheist here. As these cannot be generally diffused through a community except by the public worship of a God and public instructions in piety and morality. Therefore, to promote their happiness and secure good order, the people have a right to invest their legislature with the ability to make suitable provision for the institution of the public worship of God and the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality. So the state government and city governments are not only authorized but required to institute public worship events and, well, you can say bless you if you want. I don't care. But not only to establish public religious events, but to hire and pay people to teach Protestant Christianity. Now we would say, what? Where's the ACLU's hotline? But this is the founders' generation writing the Constitution for the state of Massachusetts, impaneling, establishing really, a Protestant approach. Now it does say all Protestant churches should be treated equally. So it's an ecumenical approach within a window.
Yeah, but that's John Adams.
But that's,
yeah, he's not a deist. He's very much
right, right. Now I will also point out this was debated in Pennsylvania, and specifically in Philadelphia, when they were debating if they wanted to start public schools, because one option was to create a government-sponsored public school like we know today, but another option was to give people basically vouchers to choose whatever kind of denominational school they wanted to attend. And Philadelphia had a lot of religious communities, just like Charleston was known as the city of churches. They had lots of different religious communities, and many of them ran their own school systems. And so the idea was for people who couldn't afford to send their kids, the government would simply pay for you to go to whatever religious style of school you chose. And they didn't see it as discriminatory because you get to pick which. We don't care which one you go to, just send your kid to a school and you pick the one that fits you. Again, it's not thinking of it from the minority group perspective that might have enough kids to make a school out of it, but the reality was that was an alternative model that could have been taken for some kind of public support for general education. It turns out, unlike what you sometimes hear from secular activists, God is mentioned in both the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. So, anyone know where God appears in the Declaration of Independence?
Well, endowed by their Creator.
Yes. Men are endowed by their Creator with the rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So, if there's a Creator, that's a euphemism for God. Now, again, it's not necessarily a God that comes down in human form, dies, and is resurrected after 3 days. I mean, it's not Christian dogma, but it's some kind of a God. And where does God appear in the Constitution? It's sort of a tricky question. We signed this Constitution in the year of our Lord.
Oh, okay. I was going to say,
1789.
the text, and I can't remember anywhere.
It's not anywhere in the text.
Okay.
It's not in the preamble.
Yeah.
We the people are the ones doing it, right?
Yeah.
But it does appear in the year of our Lord at the end.
Interesting.
And so it may have been a usage convention.
It is
Hardly a religious statement, I would say.
Year of our Lord. It sounds pretty denominational to
Well,
me.
it means
But it's
how
a
many
calendar
years since
convention.
the Lord was born.
Right, but to a Jewish year, that sounds pretty denominational.
Well, I was going to say, in a secular society in those days, How else would they accept this year?
In this our common year or whatever.
Well, they wouldn't have to say the year of the Lord necessarily.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about that
It's
detail though
implied,
is,
however.
you'll get people who say, these are the people who are not a fan of separation of religion and government, they'll say, the reason why they didn't put God in the Constitution is they just assumed. It was just part of the fabric of society, it was in the background, they didn't have to be explicit about it. And when they chose the year, that was just an example of how rooted they were in a religious context, that was the way they referred to the year. So.
I bet nobody who used that term ever thought of it being religious.
No one who ever used that
Well,
term?
okay, no one would ever,
Yeah.
but a lot of people didn't, most people didn't.
Well, that'd be an interesting exploration.
Yeah.
Now, I will point out that for some people, that wasn't enough God in the Constitution, and beginning in 1863, there have been a series of proposals to Christianize the Constitution text, in particular looking at the preamble, which begins, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice," and so on. So here's a proposed amendment that's been offered in different forms since 1863. "We the people of the United States, humbly acknowledging Almighty God as a source of all authority and power in civil government, the Lord Jesus Christ as the governor among the nations, and his revealed will as our supreme authority, in order to constitute a Christian government, to form a more perfect..." So this is the Christian nation amendment to the Constitution that's been proposed over 200 times. People have introduced some version of this amendment. It's never passed even the Senate or the House, let alone gotten to the states or anything else like that. But there was clearly a strain of American thought and politics over a long period of time that wanted a more explicitly Christian and a less separationist vision for the country.
Well, this is part of a movement that, particularly after the Great Awakening in the early 19th century, that set out to rewrite history and create the government of the United States as a Christian government, which it wasn't and wasn't created that way, but then they went back to rewrite it that way. And that was what they wanted to put out as their myth.
Sure. However, let me give you an example of how, even if it wasn't officially a federal Christian government, on the ground, sometimes people experienced government as Christian. If you sent your kid to a public school in the 1840s or the 1850s, they would regularly have Bible readings and prayers in the school, and this continued into the 1940s and 1950s.
1960s,
Yeah, right.
where I went to school.
There are a whole series of court cases that are passed in the 1940s to the 1960s that, at one time, in fact, the 1940s case, clergy were coming into the schools to provide instructional time on religion and morals. And that was banned. Actually, it was a case in Illinois run by a woman named Vashti McCullum. And Vashti is sort of a heroine in the Book of Esther who fights, resists the king. So it's nice that she had that name. But then there was a series of cases in the 60s about prayer in schools. But if you were in the 1840s, there was no question. You were going to a public school, it's going to be prayer. And what kind of prayer? Protestant prayer. And what kind of Bible readings? Protestant Bible readings. In fact, Catholic students who started to go to these schools said, well, this Bible isn't our Bible. Can we maybe have an alternate reading of a Catholic Bible translation as opposed to the Protestant King James Bible translation? No, said the schools. And that's why the Catholic school movement started in the US in the 1840s and 50s, because they were not allowed to practice their style of Christianity in the public schools. It was a Protestant establishment. Protestant Bible readings, Protestant prayers. So much so that by the 1870s, with the rise of the Catholic population after the massive waves of immigration from first Ireland and then ultimately Italy and other parts of Eastern Europe, there's a whole series of amendments in state constitutions, and there was a federal version as well, that were proposed by James Blaine, who was an anti-Catholic activist. So this is the 1875 proposed federal version of the Blaine Amendment, which said, "No state shall make any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and no money raised by taxation in any state for the support of public schools or derived from any public fund therefore, nor any public lands devoted thereto, shall ever be under the control of any religious sect." Now, does that mean he wanted to get the Protestant readings out of it? No. This is to stop any money going to Catholic schools, stop any property being given to Catholic schools, stop any public funds going to Catholic schools, or tax dollars going to support religious education. In fact, the religious right today is really stymied by many of these state constitutional amendments because they want money to go to religious schools. And it was the Protestant anti-Catholic animus of the 1870s that has now hamstrung them in those states that still have these amendments in place. But this was originally done because the Protestants owned the public schools. So it's not as if it was, your choice was a secular school or a Catholic school. It was a Protestant school or a Catholic, it's just the Protestant school was called the public school. So, when you say that it wasn't a Christian country, it wasn't in the federal laws, it wasn't in some respects, but the context for some experiences of government, including public schools, did actually come across in a Protestant way. Now, if we had wanted to go a radical route of separation, we could have gone the Soviet, cut out all religion, ban religion, create a league of militant atheists that goes around trying to teach people how to be atheists, turn churches and synagogues into museums of that old, silly, primitive culture. I mean, they were really anti-religion in the Soviet Union, but that might be too far. Or you might find a middle ground in French, what they call laïcité, or secularism. But there, if you're participating in the public square, you can't use private religious symbols. So if you're attending a public French school, you can't wear a hijab over your head, you can't wear a cross, and you can't wear a Jewish star or a yarmulke, because those are denominational, and in a public square, we're all the same. They've also tried to ban the burkini, which is an extra long bathing suit for Muslim or Orthodox Jewish women to wear with their modesty rules on public beaches. So this is an imposed secularism that says your free exercise is less important than making sure everybody's equal, wearing the same things, and not identifiable as a different religious group. This is fraternité in an imposed model. Again, that feels a little bit too impositional for us with our sense of personal exercise.